Okay, and we are live. A very good afternoon to everybody. I'm Nadine Paris, and I've got a very special guest to do. Good morning. Good afternoon, Matthew.
Good afternoon. How are you doing?
I'm great, thanks. And we were just discussing that you logged in, I think, about 30 seconds ago, and I was wondering what was happening. So I was trying to communicate with you, sending you emails and messages on LinkedIn saying, "Where are you, Matthew?" And you've just been non-stop.
Which is a great thing because, I mean, you're trying to communicate with me and you're getting nothing back. And I mean, sometimes that happens, right? Which is a very appropriate experience, given that we're here to talk about communication and the difficulties therewith.
Indeed. But I'm not used to that because, you see, we've kind of worked a little bit together and you always respond quite quickly. So I made the assumption that you would respond to me almost immediately. And as you didn't, I have to say that I was starting to get quite worried about it, thinking, that's not like Matthew, because I had expectations.
Absolutely. And of course, what we never know is what's going on at the other end sometimes. And even sometimes, even when that other person's right in front of us, we don't always know what's going on internally, do we? So yes, but in this particular case, my apologies for my tardiness or my very promptness, because I was just on time.
You were on time. On time. I'll forgive you. In fact, there is nothing to forget. You were absolutely on time. So all is good. Matthew, we met a couple of years ago, didn't we? We went to a training together, Sam Rattling.
Oh, yes, absolutely. The marvelous Sam Rattling, absolutely fantastic.
Yes.
The best LinkedIn trainer that's out there. So a little bit of a plug for Sam there.
But yes, absolutely. Yeah. And we want to thank her. She's an amazing lady who has trained us both for LinkedIn. And maybe the fact that we're here today is a little bit a legacy, we could say. Who knows?
Yes, I think that's pretty fair. Yes, well done, Sam. Thank you for that.
And you and I, we've kept in touch over the past few years, and I've been watching you. I've been following you. I comment on your post.
You do.
And I know that you've been working with Sandler. You're accredited to deliver the Sandler training. And I always look at your tagline, your headline. I always look at that. And I've noticed that recently you've changed it.
Yeah, I got a little bit of feedback on it, based around, actually making your headline very much around the outcomes that you deliver for people, but also adding a little bit of emotive language, deliberately emotive language in there to see if you can pique a little bit of interest, do something a little bit different. And so, eradicating sales and management issues and that sort of thing. That I'm paraphrasing slightly because I can't remember exactly what I wrote, but it's something around there. So there's some quite emphatic words that I've used in there. So, but it's very deliberate, and it does seem to have driven some more engagement. So who knows?
Okay, so which shows actually, and which goes well with what we want to have a chat about today, because we thought we could talk about communication. We thought that within communication we could look at influencing, perhaps persuading, and also those difficult conversations. And I mentioned pricing, which I'm sure that people talk to you about. And also, your experience in terms of with your clients, where do you see communication going well, and how do you see it going not well, and looking at miscommunication? If we start, Matthew, with kind of defining what is miscommunication, what would you say it is?
That's a really good place to start with a definition. I think the key thing here is when you've got communication, true communication, what you have is shared understanding.
Yeah.
So miscommunication is anything where there is a difference of understanding. Now, I want to be very clear here. Understanding doesn't necessarily mean agreement. It just means that you both mean the same thing by what it is that's being said. So you can, at least if you're going to disagree, you're disagreeing about the right things. And that can also be then the route for constructive conflict or constructive disagreement, as opposed to something which is destructive and tends to get sucked into drama and something that's unhelpful. But yeah, I suppose miscommunication is really about anything where there's a disconnect in understanding.
Okay, right. So I'm going to be doing something that I've never done in my LinkedIn Live, which is to talk about politics. Okay. So I am looking at an email that were sent to all the staff at Downing Street. And the email says, after what's been an incredibly busy period, we thought it would be nice to make the most of this lovely weather and have some socially distanced drinks in the number 10 garden this evening. So please join us at 6 o'clock and bring your own booze. Okay. Right. So that's a fairly I think I understand what it means. I think that the wording is clear enough for me to think that I am going to go to an evening where people are going to just chill out and relax and drink and be outside in the garden of, it doesn't really mean that I'm going to be working. I don't see the word working in that email. And I don't think that there is something implying that not only we'll be drinking, but we will also be working. And yet yesterday I was watching Boris Johnson said that he didn't realize that it was a party. You see, for me, this is quite an interesting example of communication, or miscommunication. I don't think that this is miscommunication at all. I think that it's very clear. What do you think, Matthew? What are your thoughts?
I mean, I'm not going to be drawn specifically into the politics of this one, but I completely agree with you. I mean, as soon as you got a word like booze in there, let's be honest. I mean, booze is actually, or whilst it's being used as a noun in that context, actually it originates as a verb.
Yeah.
As in the verb to booze, and it's a slang term that actually has Scandinavian roots, and it basically about consuming excessive amounts of alcohol. That's literally what the root is. Now, I don't know what kind of jobs that you've done in your life, but have you ever done a job where consuming excessive amounts of alcohol is deemed to be a professional thing to do, or something that is the sort of conduct where you're likely to I don't think the email was miscommunication. If there's any miscommunication, it's likely to be in the prevarication that's currently happening with the sort of post hoc justification of it, which is, let's be honest, a load of nonsense. But anyway, sorry.
But it is interesting, isn't it? Because you and I today were talking about communication. So you can have a very clear email, no matter what email it is. I chose this one because I thought it was quite appropriate and timely to speak about it. But you can have a very clear email that's giving you information, it's giving you the place, the time, what we are going to do. So very specific. And then for somebody to understand something completely differently, where actually you wonder, how could you possibly understand that it was something different?
Yeah.
And it could, it doesn't have to be related to that email.
Sure.
It could be a work email whereby you send something and then somebody thinks it's something else. I mean, is it that? It's interesting. I have somebody commenting, rumor that that the best parties are the ones you fail to remember. Okay.
Yeah, that was an amazing party. I can't remember it at all.
Yeah. But how can it happen that somebody sends you a very clear email, and actually very short as well, isn't it? 2 lines, very short, to the point, and that somebody else understands something completely different? Is that because they want to understand something different?
Well, that's an interesting question, and actually, moving away from the sort of slightly flippant phraseology I've just been using, I think the key thing here is about making sure that there are. Well, you started this beautifully by wanting to define terms. Now, why did you do that? It's because we wanted to achieve that shared understanding. Looking at probably something with a similar kind of, I suppose, intellectual level to our illustrious political leaders. I was talking to the wonderful Mr. Roy Johnson the other day, my business partner, person I work with, and his grandson, delightful little boy. He's of an age where he wants to be helpful, and there was a spillage in the kitchen, and Roy's wife Angela, his nana, says, "Oh, we're going to need to get a pan," meaning like a dustpan and brush to kind of brush things up.
Ah,
Now,
okay.
little boy, because he just hears Nana saying, we need to get a pan. So he totters over to the cupboard and he gets out like a little saucepan and goes and there you go, Nana. And it's just a difference in understanding of what the word pan meant. And sometimes, so we're just talking about a disconnect in understanding because there's a difference of understanding what the word means. Now, I was very flippant there and I talked about the fact that the word booze has got a Scandinavian etymology and the fact that it started out as a verb. Most people wouldn't know that. It just only happens to be that I used to run a company with the word booze in the title, so I had occasion to learn where that word came from in the first place. But most people aren't going to know it, but most people do have an understanding of what it means. So, but it's quite possible, I suppose, if I was being really kind, that maybe somebody's got a different understanding of what the word means, or even what bring your own means. Maybe it's that you're on your own recognizance. You're going to be entirely responsible for whether or not you choose to consume alcohol at this thing, because it is, of course, a work-sponsored event, and therefore it is really work. Honest. I mean, I'm stretching it a bit there.
Do you think that when we are, drafting emails, when we are sending emails to people, do you think there is a method or a kind of framework that we can use so that we can think about how it's going to be received and how it could be interpreted so that you avoid miscommunication? And then you avoid being in a situation where you think, how on earth could you think like that? You at the receiving end. Do you think there is something that people can do to avoid being misunderstood?
Yeah, certainly think about the words you're using. Think about your audience is the key thing.
Yeah.
And if you don't know your audience and you're not intimately acquainted with how they tend to read things or don't read things, because that's also the problem. People only half read things. Then if in doubt, pick up the phone. I'm a big fan of avoiding written communication if at all possible. There's this old thing from NLP around, the 70, 38, 55 split between the words you use, the tone of voice that you use, and the body language that will underpin it, body language including facial expression and everything else. And the problem with written communication is that it leaves such a huge percentage of potential for connection on the table. And as a result, it also increases the chance of ambiguity, misunderstanding, and just generally kind of getting the wrong end of the stick. So I'm a huge believer in if you can, reduce the chances for misunderstanding by actually having a verbal communication with somebody if you can. And the great example I always use with my clients on this one is if there's any disconnect between what you say and the way you say it, it's the way that you say it that will carry the meaning. So the example I usually give in my classes is something like, so if I said to you, oh, I'm really frustrated, the chances are you wouldn't believe me because I don't sound very frustrated. Whereas if I said, oh, really frustrated, it carries more weight and more meaning because the way that I've said it actually lands and it sort of sounds genuine. Whereas you don't get that sort of nuance in straight written communication. So, and I'm not suggesting that this one from Downing Street had any nuance in it at all. It seemed pretty black and white to me. But again, that's how these things are taken.
But the interesting thing as well is that when you send emails like the one that we've just mentioned, people talk about it when you organize parties. And I mean, I remember when I was a head teacher and we would do, an end of year gathering in the staff room to thank the staff who are leaving, and you hear people talk about it and being very happy that, we're going to be celebrating, what happened this year in the school. And so you can quickly hear if something has been misunderstood because people talk. So even if you've sent something that is not clear, you can make some adjustment when you speak to just realign. And here it doesn't seem to have been the case, but there is a difference, isn't it, between what we write and how we speak.
Yes. Yeah, very much.
And I think that for me as a bilingual, I certainly find it easier at times to just speak, and explain, and because emails should not be too long and should be sent on specific days for certain organizations, before specific time. If you are in certain countries, there are quite a lot of rules there. Speaking to people is a lot more organic, it's authentic, and people have the choice to ask you questions directly and, in the midst of the moment. Whereas an email, once you press send, then that's kind of it, isn't it?
Yeah, and it sometimes happens the other way around, doesn't it? Where you send off an email and you're sitting there waiting for a response thinking, oh, I wonder if they've misunderstood me. Oh, I hope I haven't caused offense. And you start agonizing about it. I mean, I do all my best editing the minute after I press send. So, after I've sent the darn thing, that's when I'm starting to question myself and going, should I have said that? Should I have done? It's always just easier to speak to somebody if you can. And if you think about it, I mean, the point about you just made about the staff room example, even if somebody was sitting there or pacing around the staff room and not actually joining in on the conversation, you can pick up just from their manner and their body and how they're holding themselves, whether or not they're looking forward to this thing, they're excited just like everybody else is, or whether maybe they've taken offense at something or they've just taken things the wrong way. You can pick up on so many cues in that kind of physical environment, which are all forms of communication, but they're not overt and they're not necessarily intentional, but they are there. And actually they're far more expressive and eloquent than most of us can be when we're speaking.
It's interesting you mentioned picking cues, but I don't know about you, but I'm talking to a lot of people at the moment who are quite tired. And when you're tired, it's difficult to pick up cues when you're face to face. And I think it's even more difficult when you're on screen and when now people, don't really put their, you can't see them. So they put their camera off and you just hear the voice, right? So here, everything relies on your kind of assumption, your intuition.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can get everything wrong. Your reading can be quite wrong. Your reading of the situation can be quite wrong, isn't it? So in the world that we are living today, what can we do to try, when we are wanting to pick up cues, to try to get it right? Like we're not picking up the cues that is not real, or
That's a great question, actually, because I think I've got a sort of two-part answer to that. And the first part is we've got to own our own stuff. We've got to own our 100% of our 50% of any interaction, if that makes sense. So, the bit that we can control is what we do. Yeah. So the first thing is we need to show up ourselves. We need to be very present if we possibly can be, utilizing our active listening. But most importantly, we've got to actually be projecting our own cues for them to pick up on. And, when you're doing this kind of thing, interacting via two bits of glass, where I've got a camera lens in front of me and you've got a screen in front of you, if the two of us are talking remotely as we are right now, you need to up the energy levels by about 20% versus what you do in a sort of in-person type of meeting, because actually it's that kind of projection that's needed to kind of get your point across. Sure. And to bring across your personality and maybe even how you're feeling about something. Maybe it feels even like you're overemphasizing things, but the analogy that I use is it's a bit like when an actor is standing on a stage and trying to project into an audience. There's a bit of distance here. We need to project a little bit. So that's the first thing, is to own your own half of it. The second part of it I alluded to when I said active listening. And active listening is very often almost thought of as a set of techniques. It's nodding to show that you're listening. It's going, these sort of non-verbal cues, saying, I'm listening to what you're saying. And then maybe even repeating or rephrasing some of the things that's said, which is all true. But it tends to come across as being a technique if it is done as a technique. If it's done as a move to kind of say, hey, I'm very good at listening, then that's what it comes across as. So the key thing here is the mindset, it's the attitude. You're there to genuinely hear and understand the other person, to make sure that they feel like they are seen and felt. If you are showing up in good faith with that as your mindset, then you tend to be in the sort of position where you're going to build much more trust much more quickly. And by doing that, and also having a very clear kind of open agreement, what we in Sandler would call an upfront contract, which sort of sets the parameters for the relationship and manages expectations on both sides, you can get to a point where you can say, well, actually, you've not got your camera on at the moment. Do you mind me sharing with you? I feel a little bit of a disadvantage. I'm struggling to kind of understand what it is you're telling me. And is that down to a bandwidth thing, or do you just not want me to see the pile of dirty washing that's sitting behind you? Or is it down to, actually something else? Are you feeling uncomfortable being on camera? Not everybody likes being on camera. I get it. Yeah. But by building that rapport and being genuine and open and vulnerable and showing your own discomfort with this thing, then it's about creating real human connection. And only by creating that real human connection have you got the best chance of mitigating the misunderstanding and picking up on those non-verbal cues, which is really the root of good communication. I don't know if that answers the question at all.
I think it's, I would say that, but I think it's a great answer. You mentioned active listening. I want to come back to it in 30 seconds. I just want to talk about Natalie. Natalie is a keen listener. She's on my LinkedIn Live actually nearly every week. And she says, I have to make a big effort not to make my language too flowery, especially over email, if I'm asking someone to do things. It's been a confidence thing, as it can be nerve-wracking being straight to the point sometimes, especially being new in a role or early in career. And I do want to come back to active listening, but I also want to talk about generations, X, Y, and, I want to talk about that because I want to ask you if you think that the style of communicating and the style of being understood, do you think that depending on the type of generation, people that we've got in front of us, do you think that we should adapt our language?
Yes, is the short answer to that. The longer answer is that it's probably reductive to talk purely in terms of generational trends, although there are trends within different generations. It's probably better to think of actually tailoring your communication style to the individual that you're talking to. So thinking about the individual more than sort of how that individual exists as part of a wider group, be it millennials or Gen X or Gen Y or Gen Z or boomers or whatever the various phrases are.
Yeah.
I mean, you're right. There are some kind of trends that will, you can broadly fit into these different stereotypes and these different kind of these different social groups or socioeconomic groups or demographics or whatever you want to call them. But it really does vary just as much from person to person as it does from generation to generation. I would make the observation that I've got a 22-year-old who's going to be 23 next month. So I think right in the sweet spot of I think the generation we're probably talking about here. Yeah. And I think it's fair to say that they are very comfortable with written communication because and they're very good with their thumbs, but less so with the telephone communication. I mean, I think it's fair to say that we've all got these things these days, these smartphones. The last thing they ever use it for is actually picking up the phone and talking. It's all written communication, but it's a very different form of written communication to the ones that I would have been comfortable with when I was the same age. Yeah. Does that make it bad? No, it doesn't. Actually, interesting. There's a higher degree usage of things like emojis and things like that, which actually seek to do or seek to mitigate some of the challenges we were just talking about with the lack of tone of voice and the lack of body language, because they're actually seeking to say, here is the intent behind these words. And that's an interesting point, because it clearly says that they're suffering from exactly the same challenge as the one we've just talked about. They've actually got a solution, or at least a form of mitigation, which isn't the one that I use, which is picking up the phone. They both work. So I'm not going to knock it. It's not my style.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned emojis, because I've worked with some Generation Z clients who sometimes send me messages on WhatsApp, and I don't get I have to ask them, what does this one mean? Or who are using acronyms or other jargons, and I'm thinking, what does that mean? So it's more that perhaps sometimes I feel less educated, less and I've got 4 children who are Gen Z, so I should know, but I think it's evolving so quickly that it's quite difficult to always catch up with it, and to always really understand what does that mean. I mean, what are they talking about? And another thing that I've noticed is that the kind of conversations that I certainly seem to be having a lot with Gen Z, and the kind of communication is about values. We tend to talk, I know we must not generalize, but I just find it interesting that I tend to spend quite a bit of time talking about values with younger individuals, as opposed to people like you and I. I don't think I would talk values with you, but I wouldn't bring it to the table yet.
Yeah.
Sometime in conversation with younger people, they do bring that on the table. So I just find that quite interesting.
It is, and you're right. The slightly different. I mean, I don't like generalizing too much, but there are a reason why we do these generalizations, or we make these generalizations, is because it does help us to a certain extent to kind of frame what we're talking about. I guess the key thing is that we don't want to let those generalizations take the place of any specific individual interactions or nuanced adjustments we might make for an interaction with an individual. But you're right. I mean, broadly speaking, I mean, one of the things that is quite a commonplace observation about Gen Z is that they do tend to be much more values led than maybe their predecessors, and certainly maybe our generation and the generation before us. But it's more about, I mean, this whole Simon Sinek thing of start with why. People don't buy what you sell. They buy your reason for doing it. They buy who you are. And that's a really interesting way of looking at things, because it speaks to a trend that moves away from big corporate approaches to marketing. And there's a brilliant book. It's called Marketing Rebellion by a guy called Mark Schaefer. Where he's talking almost about the next revolution in marketing, and it's very much this sort of migration towards this values-led approach, where actually you can sell things for quite a lot more money in a more artisanal way, because it's actually values-led, and it's about where it comes from and its provenance and so forth. And that's a really interesting point, and I think probably quite timely given the mess that we've made of the planet.
Yeah.
You started with politics. Let's not get into that as well.
Yes. Yeah. No. Let's not get into climate change. Okay. It's interesting what you've just said, because I think the communication I've had with different types of clients, different generations, has actually made me reviewed how I was communicating in terms of business proposal. And I even though I don't belong necessarily to the generation where I talk a lot about my values, I'm actually systematically including them in my communication. And I think at times they're helping me with my communication as to why am I writing that? How is what I am writing reflecting my values? How is that aligning? And am I talking the language of my values? Because if people go to my website, they will see that I have the values, and I think it's important to show alignments between your language, your everyday language, to the values that you are claiming, right? That are very important for me. So I now talk a lot more in my business conversation, in my communication, with be it written or be it verbal. I talk a lot more about my values, because it's important for people to hear that. Have you found that you have changed the way you communicate with your clients, the last 2 years?
Yes. Not led in quite the same way, because I think because I suppose I do quite a lot of goal setting work, and goals typically only really get delivered if they are fully aligned with your personal values and your, I suppose to a certain extent, your vision for yourself and your own life, whatever that is and whatever that looks like. So I have always, well, not always, but certainly for a number of years, I've tried to kind of make sure that I'm living those values, and the language that I use therefore ought to reflect those values, because they are, you know, fundamental to my mindset, and they're fundamental to the way I approach life. So things like, you know, equal business stature with all clients and with prospects, honorable and ethical approach, having integrity, generosity of spirit, kindness, wit and intelligence, curiosity, all of those kinds of values. They should really sing through in everything that I do and everything that I say and everything that I am, without sounding too pompous or arrogant about it. That should be there, because it's kind of they are underpinning literally everything that I do. So they should be much more than just a sign on a boardroom wall that says, here are the things that we value. Because certainly I have worked for companies where that's really what the values are. They're a sign that lives on the wall, and that's the only place they live, because they certainly don't live in the corporate behaviors. And I think, you know, to answer your point, I guess, have I found that my messaging lands better as a result of that? Yes, I would say it does. And I would say that the critical thing here is that it underpins the way in which I approach any interaction. So, for example, and this is something we teach as well. So it's entirely congruent with the system that we teach, which is, if you are having an interaction with a prospective client, you know, you seek the truth, not the sale. You seek to serve, not to sell. So it's really, does what I do actually add value to you as a potential client? Do you have the sorts of problems that we can solve? If you do have the problems that we can solve, are we the best people to solve them? If we are, then actually I've now got a moral duty to help you to get hold of this solution. If we're not, then I have a moral duty to actually help you to find it somewhere else, because I'm not the right person for you. Mm-hmm. And that as a core value is a critical approach, which, of course, if you live that and you do it genuinely, it's not disingenuous, it's not a move that you're doing on somebody, it's not a technique. Well, that sings through in everything that you do. And of course, people tend to respond accordingly. You know, the world will reflect what you project. So if you're projecting that as a genuine mindset, then obviously people are going to respond in kind, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I know, because I can speak, because you have taken me through this conversation. We've been through it together. And so I can certify that what you've just said is actually something that you do, because you've taken me through it. And it's a very powerful way, actually, of communicating. It's very authentic, because you are giving the choice of the person who is listening to say, actually, no. Yeah. Or actually, this is what I want, but you're not the right person. And you're being very honest and very transparent and saying, actually, I may not be the right person for you.
Absolutely. And it's what a nice way of doing business. It's really, I mean, I sleep nights. I sleep like a baby, because, you know, it's genuinely a nice way of doing business. And I suppose the flip side of this is, if you are going to do business together, you end up doing it for the right reasons. Yeah. And, you know, I think I was talking probably, oh gosh, it's got to be about 2.5 years ago with Roy, who I mentioned before, and one of the things we came to this blinding realization: it's actually impossible to sell something using our system that somebody doesn't need. You can't sell them something they don't need. It just doesn't work, because actually the whole thing is that ethical. It is all about doing something that's in their best interest.
So coming back to Natalie, who said, you know, I'm kind of struggling to ask someone to do something in an email. It can be quite nerve-wracking, right? So what could you advise her to do? How could we help her, you know, send those emails where actually she's asking somebody to do something? I mean, if you're the line manager, or, you know, if it's your colleague, you need them to do something. So what would be your advice?
I mean, I guess context is everything for this. And I don't no, Natalie, and sorry, Natalie, apologies. I'm about to make some gross assumptions on your behalf, and I'm probably going to get it horribly wrong, thereby illustrating the point we're making about miscommunication. So sorry about this, and in advance, as I get it badly wrong. But assuming that in this case, Natalie's the line manager, I think you said she's relatively new into the role.
Yeah.
I think there's a certain amount of growing into the role and establishing the cultural norms within the business of internal language, the house style. If the house style is to be very direct, very black and white, then adopt that house style. And don't feel bad about doing it just because you've been brought up to be terribly polite and mind your P's and Q's and add some pleases and thank yous and little bits of flowery language around it. But beyond that, I would generally speaking be advising anybody, especially if they're in a new managerial position, not to be issuing instructions by emails. I would typically be suggesting that what you do is you get a one-to-one on a weekly basis with all of your direct reports. During that one-to-one, you should be spending some time in the supervisory element of actually working with them and saying, okay, here are the things that need to be done. These are role-specific tasks. These are functional tasks that need to be carried out. Here's the things that I need you to do. Then based on what it is they do, whether they do or don't do the things you've told them to do, that gives you feedback. And that feedback then tells you what else you need to do. So it might be that actually they don't know how to do it, in which case you need to train them, or you need to get training for them as the line manager so that they know how to do this thing. If they do know how to do it, but for some reason they're still not doing it, well, maybe that's a time when you need to adjust their perception of what they should be doing in this particular environment. That's not how we do things around here. Culturally, we do things this way. And if that's not what you want to do, that's fine. You probably need to go and be a flower in somebody else's garden. Don't mean to be horrible, but not everybody is going to fit in every business, right? So determine the can'ts and the won'ts is, I guess, what I'm talking about there. But if they can do it, but maybe they can improve on what they've done, and they are doing it, but they can improve on what they're doing, well, that's where the most important role that you have as a manager comes in, and that's to coach them. And you're coaching them through asking them the sorts of questions that will help them to self-discover how they can improve what it is they're doing. Or if it's not improvable because fundamentally they did something that just isn't very good, well, they can at least self-discover they need to do something different next time. And if there was something that was magnificent that they did, well, maybe you can help them to self-discover they need to do more of that next time, because not everything they do is going to be bad. But what that does is it empowers them, it leads them to improve, and it gets them to do the best that they can possibly do and be the best they can possibly be. And guess what? It frees up your time because you're now getting things done rather than having to do it yourself. You cannot do any of that by email. So I would strongly suggest that as any kind of a manager in any position, you're doing things as much as you can face to face. Now, I appreciate that's difficult when you're doing things via Zoom or you're doing things via Teams or whatever the normal cadence of these things is. But if you have to issue like a mass instruction, well, you need to talk to your direct reports at least to make sure that the true message is getting cascaded properly.
Yeah, I am very much in favor and totally agree with what you're saying. I remember actually enjoying my one-to-one with my teams, with each member of my team when I was ahead. And I agree that it is better to talk things through. However, what I've discovered with experience is that sometimes people forget. And not because they intentionally forget. We're all tired. So depending on when is the meeting, can be quite difficult to remember everything. This is the moment where emails would come in for me, because I would always send a quick email, just recapping, the main action points. And I guess, being a complete finisher and finishing that loop, just making sure that there was something in speaking, using the words and everything, okay? But there is also something in writing, so that both of us have a common understanding that what we've discussed is actually what's in writing, and people can refer to it as they continue to work and until our next meeting. And then in our next meeting, we pick up where we left it in case there are any questions. So that's kind of how I was working. I wouldn't, and I know you didn't mean that. I'm sure the email was going to come, but I would still have the email, but as in a loop in my process.
Beautiful, absolutely, and I love the reference to the Myers-Briggs things there. Just complete to finish it. Yes, yeah, finish it off. No, that's spot on, because people will recall how the meeting felt long after they recall the content of the meeting. So if they remember the overall feeling of the meeting was consultative, collaborative, you had a meeting of minds, if you like, and then they can refer back to the email, which is just in black and white. We agreed you were going to do X, Y, Z, bang, 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 because that removes the ambiguity. And as a wise man once said to me, ambiguity at the top will lead to politics at the bottom. That quote, I think, goes to Marcus Kauke, who produces some great content on LinkedIn. If you ever want to follow his content, it's always magnificent. But yeah, ambiguity at the top leads to politics at the bottom. I mean, it's so true, because if people don't understand where things are coming from or the intention behind them, then ultimately they're going to end up kind of in, well, probably some very unhealthy drama lower down in the hierarchy, shall we say.
Yeah. Somebody on LinkedIn he's a LinkedIn he or she is a LinkedIn user. I don't know who it is, but that person says, I don't see please and thank you as flowery. Being direct doesn't mean you have to drop those words, but Matthew knows me and I may be a bit too flowery. So Matthew, you must know that person. And I actually agree that, the please and thank you, I think it's really important in any communication.
I completely agree, and to have whoever LinkedIn user is, hello, yes, thank you very much for your point, to the point you've just made, and as you know me, you know that I'm almost polite to a fault because it's how I was brought up. So yeah, I very rarely would ever drop pleases and thank yous. I would struggle with that. I think the illustration or the example I was using was very much based on Natalie's point around the fact that she felt she had to be quite direct in the language she was using. So it was a specific example there. But yeah, I completely agree with you. And I'm very much a please may I rather than a do this.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think that level of courtesy costs anything, and frankly, it's just that.
It's respect and politeness. I just want to go back to active listening, which I said I would go back 30 seconds ago, and that must have been 20 minutes ago now. I've always found this expression, active listening. I feel like I want to rebel when I hear that, because I'm thinking, oh, okay, so is there inactive listening? For me, listening is listening. You listen, you give 100% your ear and, your full attention to people. I'm a little bit puzzled about why we've added the word active in front of it.
I think it's a very fair challenge, because listening itself is a cognitive act, as distinguished from hearing. And I guess the problem, the reason why people coined this phrase active listening is to basically emphasize the fact that if you're going to listen, it has to be active. It has to have your higher brain functions, your cognitive parts of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, actually engaged. As distinguished from hearing, which is a physiological thing, that's just one of our five senses. The listening part is the bit that actually goes on up here in this 1.2 kilos of computational jelly that sits between our ears. So it's the bit between our ears that's doing the listening bit, not the actual ears themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I guess I would agree with you that actually the word active makes it a tautology. Basically it's I don't need the word active, because listening itself is an active act, if that's not a clumsy sentence. But so many people, and I'm sure you've encountered this yourself over the years, they will be nominally paying attention to what's being said to them, but you can almost see them glaze over halfway through as they start to think about what they're going to say next.
Yes.
And so they're actually listening to reply rather than listening to understand. And I suppose the phrase active listening, clumsy though it is, it's a useful tool to make it very clear to people that actually, if you really want to show up for people, you actually have to be listening properly, not listening to think of the clever thing you're going to say next, but actually because you want to understand what's being said to you.
I love that, actually. One of my guilt point when I was perhaps younger in my career is that I would always interrupt people, and I wasn't aware I would do that. I was passionate, keen, in meetings. And once when I was doing some coaching, I decided to record myself and to film myself, right? It's quite, have you ever done that, Matthew? Well, I did, okay? And I discovered I really analyze my communication styles, and so all the verbal and the non-verbal, okay? And in fact, I had some terrible habits that I could only realize once I was watching myself. Um, and we talk about communication, and it's all fine to say it's about the words and it's about clarity and all of that kind of thing, but it's also about actually how do you know that you're communicating well. What work have you done? It's not only about people's feedback. It's actually, have you seen yourself? I mean, I think that by being on Zoom, for example, or Teams, I've never watched myself so much on the screen than what I've done in the past 2 years. And actually, that in itself is quite an exercise, isn't it? Because you have to face yourself for, like, we've been speaking for 45 minutes. I've been watching myself for 45 minutes on the screen.
Wow.
And it's quite, we can reflect on what we do, we can get better. But actually, it's what I'm trying to say is that by watching ourselves, it's an opportunity to not to be critical. We have to be kind to oneself, but also to say, well, actually, I've noticed that I'm doing this and I'm doing that, and I need to change that. And one of my, mea culpa mistake that I was making was to interrupt people. Very beginning of my career, because I was very enthusiastic. And as you get wiser, perhaps, you're very okay to actually sit, listen. It's fine. Nothing's going to happen. You can still speak. You will still have your turn. And actually, great communicators give turn for people to talk.
I think that's profoundly true. And actually, the magic happens when you shut the hell up sometimes. And certainly that happens for me. And I say that knowing with the same mea culpa that I'm absolutely, it's something I work on, but I still can't help myself because I talk a lot. Have you noticed? I will use 20 words where one will do. And so I do tend to talk, and I talk quite fast, and I tend to use quite a lot of words, and I tend to be using quite a lot of long words, and sometimes all of these things can be a barrier to communication, and actually just sometimes just being silent and letting the other person finish their point, because the reality is that everybody knows something you don't know. And it would be a terrible, terrible waste of a day if I sort of got into bed at night and thought I didn't learn anything today. Actually, I only know the stuff that I knew this morning when I got out of bed. How boring would your life be if that was the case? We have got a wealth of knowledge, and you and I are both blessed to have fantastic networks. And we mentioned a few people already today.
Yeah.
And every single person in that network knows something we don't know. And wouldn't it be terribly awful if all we ever did was try to impress them rather than actually listen to them?
Yeah. We have Charles Crosby. Actually, Charles is going to be on my LinkedIn Live next week. And Charles is talking about participative listening. I really like that, actually. And maybe we can pick that up next week. But anyway, thanks, Charles, for contributing to our discussion today. Matthew, what about difficult conversation? Because you know that I am passionate about that. Every time I have a LinkedIn, I talk about it.
Yes.
And I said that we would talk about difficult conversation related to pricing. Okay. Some people come to you, they want to do the training. It's a little bit too expensive for them. They're not quite there. How do you deal with that? Because is the conversation difficult for you as opposed to difficult for them?
That's a really interesting question, and again, probably a multi-part answer, I'm afraid. Sorry. I guess the first thing is that pricing, it's an interesting area to get into because it's tied up with a whole load of conceptual challenges around money. And money is one of those, I suppose, it's a social oddity in that it's typically tied up with a whole bunch of childhood messages and psychology. And, if you think about the earliest messages you got around money, very often they're things like money doesn't grow on trees, money's the root of all all evil. It's rude to talk about money. You shouldn't mention money, da, 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 all those sorts of, oh, we can't afford that. You shouldn't stretch to that. And, you've got to look after the pennies, the pounds will look after themselves. All of these sorts of phrases have started to kind of, right from the very, very earliest parts of our lives, form an accreted layer of scar tissue in our psyche, which is very difficult to chip open and get beyond. So actually overcoming some of the awkwardness about talking about money in the first place is quite hard. So that's one of the things that very often clients who work with us will come to us to talk to learn how to deal with, and some of it is very much a self-management thing. Mm-hmm. Some of it's around the technical side of actually how to even bring this stuff up and what the right time to bring it up is, and I suppose using, because we tend to drink our own champagne in the sense of we use our own system for when we're talking about what it is that we sell. I couldn't really teach this stuff if I didn't actually do it myself. So generally speaking, we don't get into a conversation about the level of investment that's necessary unless we know that the investment is necessary, if you see what I mean. So we'll already have understood from the potential client why it is that he or she would even want to do business with us, what it is they would want to get out of it, and what the cost of not doing it actually is. And when you understand what the cost of not doing something is, well, that becomes a very clear basis for an investment case. And so you start to have a conversation not so much about price, which is very often a euphemism for cost, and cost is something that takes something away from you. It becomes a conversation about value, which is an investment, which is something that gives something to you. And that's really the nature of the kind of conversation you have to have. So it's about framing it and framing it properly. But the first work is always, again, the stuff that goes on up here. It's self-management. It's feeling much more comfortable about it. And instead of feeling very awkward and thinking, oh, it's rude to talk about money and all that sort of thing, it's framing it in such a way that internally you're very comfortable with the fact that actually money is the language of business. And I'm fluent in talking that language because I have to be, because that's what I do. And all of us who are in business to some degree or another need to be reasonably fluent. And actually most people who come to work with us actually find they're a whole lot more fluent in that language than they think they are. So there's some conceptual and some technical challenges around bringing price up. So I suppose difficult conversations in that sense, you almost avoid them by actually setting yourself up for success in the first place. Firstly, through the agreement of the way that you're going to talk and what the rules of engagement actually are, the sorts of questions you're going to ask, the sorts of conversation you're going to have, and the nature of that conversation and what the relationship's even going to be like. So I suppose it goes back to the old Bruce Lee quote of the best way to avoid a punch is to be somewhere else. Mm. And so actually you don't necessarily need to get into a difficult conversation. It doesn't even need to be as difficult as maybe you're psyching yourself up to think it's going to be. And by, I suppose, establishing the true agreement between the two of you, you don't necessarily need to have it as a challenging conversation at all.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it's a framework, isn't it? I think I know about Sandler, thanks to you, but I think, if we have a framework and if we're also kind and respectful and, we keep saying the thank you and the please, and I think that we can have a conversation that is actually not difficult. Yes. Because we are a human removing the difficulty. This is the kindness. We are removing the difficulties so that the person on the other side doesn't deal with the emotion of the difficult. They see what they might be missing if they're not doing it. The cost, you talk a lot about the cost of not doing something. Mm-hmm. I think this is so important because in a conversation where we talk about price and where, people might feel at the beginning of the conversation, well, I'm going to talk to you, Matthew, but I know for a fact that I can't afford, mm-hmm. that training. Which is probably the mindset that they might come in, we possibly, you as a trainer, that that's going to come up. You have a framework, but it's not an inhuman framework, okay? Because sometimes we might feel, oh, well, it's just artificial intelligence, robot Matthew who is going to talk without, but sometimes, there's so many people out there talking about frameworks, and I think sometimes we forget the human's touch, Whereas in the way that you are talking, you very much, take a humanistic approach with your framework. I suppose that's what I want to say. And therefore you remove all the barriers, and actually it's a very positive conversation.
I like to think so, and certainly that's the feedback we get, and it certainly feels that way from our point of view. And like I say, if you show up with that ethical attitude of equal business stature, you tend to end up in that kind of scenario. And yes, you have, as you say, you've got a framework, you've got a process, you've got beats that you will hit. However, that's like a skeleton, and the skeleton's not the human being. The beating heart, the blood, the veins, the brain, everything else. That's the stuff that you bring to it yourself. That's the personality. That's the humanity. A process on its own isn't going to actually do anything. It requires, your active, agile presence within that sort of process. And you can't, I mean, I hate these systems that work on scripts and that kind of thing, because like you say, then you do end up in Robo Matthew.
Yeah.
And that's awful. I mean, I've never yet come across a script that you use in a real life situation and the other person's got their half of the script, because they always say something different. It doesn't work that way. That's not how real life works. So you have to have an adaptive, agile process that will work in real life when it's got real human beings involved.
And actually, it's a nice end to that LinkedIn Live, because I think I said to you a couple of months back that I had done 100 podcasts, and I was very pleased with my podcast. But I felt that I'm not saying that for you too.
No, congratulations.
I just felt that it was not quite authentic, because you edit it, you put music at the beginning and music at the end, and those messages. Whereas actually being on LinkedIn Live, you're just, as you are now. I mean, I know that when I talk, I'm not, English is not my first language. I know that when I talk, I will make mistakes. I know that my English accent is really, really very Frenchy English accent. I know that. And yet, I'm on LinkedIn Live and I'm fine about that. It's what makes me who I am. But what I'm trying to say is that we've had a communication today. We've communicated very well for nearly an hour, okay? And there was no script. We had no idea. I mean, we knew that we were going to talk about communication, but we had not written the script. Questions I ask you were, am I active listening, picking up on, exploring, clarifying, and but I didn't prepare anything. And neither did you. And actually, you said to me you had a 4 hours board meeting, then you had a client, and then you kind of ran to be on my LinkedIn Live. So, no time to prepare. And I think that's the beauty of LinkedIn Live, the authenticity of the conversation.
Absolutely, I could not agree more. I love it. I love that intimacy. I love the reality of it. I love the fact that anything could happen. It could be, and luckily, even though we steered very, very close to the wind to talk about politics, we both managed to not swear or anything. We're very, very polite. See, we are very polite people, aren't we?
We are. Thank you, Matthew. So I know you're on LinkedIn, but if people want to contact you, how do they go about that?
Oh, thank you for asking. I appreciate that. That's very nice of you. Well, if anybody did want to get in contact with me, my email address is incredibly easy, despite me having this very long double-barreled name that you can sort of see there below me on the screen. Don't worry, you don't have to write all of that. My goodness me. Just choose my initials, mdh@sandler.com. It's as easy as that. That's a really easy way to get hold of me. Otherwise, I do actually quite like talking on the phone. So 07715 269 724, 07715 269 724. Love to have a chat.
Brilliant. That's brilliant. And now you're going to be receiving millions of WhatsApp and text and phone calls. But that's actually brilliant. Thanks so much, Matthew, for coming on my LinkedIn Live. And keep doing the great work that you do on LinkedIn. I love your post. And I love your work on goals. I think they are what you write is very clear, and it makes me want to continue to have conversations with you. So thanks a lot, Matthew.
Thank you for having me, and you right back at you. I always will continue to comment on all of your posts as well. So fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. Lovely to see you.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our people who've been watching us from all over the world and who have been contributing to the discussion today. Thank you very much. See you next week. Bye.